Hey, it's chapter 14 time. We're going to be learning about population ecology today. So population ecology fits into the overarching umbrella of ecology, which is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. And so there's lots of different levels that you can study ecology at. You can study individual organisms and how they interact with their environment. We're not going to be talking too much about that in this class, but it is an interesting topic. We're going to start out talking about populations, and you've already learned the definition of populations. Populations are a group of individuals of the same species, meaning if you follow the biological species concept, they can interbreed with each other. So we're going to be looking at how populations interact with their environment and each other and that kind of thing. In chapter 15, we're going to move on to communities, and communities are how different populations kind of interact with each other. And then we'll move on to ecosystems in chapter 15 as well, looking at how all the communities are interacting with the abiotic or non-living elements of that environment that they live in. Okay, but this one is chapter 14 right now. We're going to focus on population ecology. And if you're going to learn any one thing about population ecology, the thing that you need to remember is it's all about population size and population growth patterns. So we'll talk a little bit more about what growth patterns means, but basically population ecology is studying how those populations grow or shrink. For example, if a population is growing, clearly in a positive manner, clearly the population is getting bigger. You can have neutral growth. I know it sounds weird to say growth and neutral at the same time, but neutral growth basically means that it's not growing. It's almost an oxymoron in some ways, but the population size is staying stable. And that word stable is extremely important for understanding population ecology. Stable populations are populations that are not getting bigger or not shrinking. They're staying the same size. You can also have negative population growth. Again, sounds a little strange, but negative population growth simply means that the population is shrinking. So again, if you're going to focus on any one thing, and remember any one thing as I'm going through this lecture, please remember that population ecology is all about how population is growing, and growth can be positive, neutral, or negative. So you can look at how the population size is influenced by other species. You can look at how the population is influenced by environmental factors, and we will do that as well. For now, you should know that populations can grow really, really quickly. They can grow, we say, exponentially. And it was Darwin who, based on Malthus, if you'll remember back in chapter 8, who first really started getting us thinking about how populations grow. You had a lab question about this, and I'm going to read this quote to you. It says, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being," he's talking about populations here, "naturally increases at so high a rate that, if not destroyed, the earth would be covered by the progeny of a single pair." Again, that simply means that that populations can increase really, really fast. And so fast that if something didn't get in the way of that growth, that you could literally cover the earth by the offspring, grandchildren, great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of that single mating pair. So here's some food for thought. Remember I just talked to you about stable populations, right? Those are populations that are neither growing nor shrinking. Their population size is staying the same. So think about this for a second. If you have a fish, we'll pick the cod for some, I don't know why, but that's the fish we're picking. So female cod can lay 5 million eggs in the course of her life. She can lay 5 million eggs on average, right? More or less. But over the course of her life, of all of her offspring, how many in a stable population, how many of them will survive and grow themselves to adulthood and reproduce? Now, this is an interesting question. When I ask this in front of a class, a lot of people say, well, maybe half of them will will live. So that's like 2.5 million eggs will become adults, and they'll all have babies. But remember, I just told you that stable populations means zero population growth. That means in the long run, they are neither growing nor shrinking. And so if you have a female cod, she's probably mated with the male, right, in order to have fertilized eggs. She will only have two surviving offspring that grow to adulthood on average. So, I mean, some are going to be a little bit better than others, right? We learned about that in natural selection. So, um, so basically, those two that I just told you about, those are ones that are going to replace the parents. So in their entire lifetime, they will, generally speaking, in a stable population, only have two surviving offspring. All right, so hopefully you understand stable offspring and stable populations with that point. Here's my next food for thought. Who leaves more surviving offspring in a stable population? A pair of elephants or a pair of rabbits? Now, hopefully you know that elephants don't have that many babies, and rabbits, well, they mate like rabbits, right? They have lots and lots and lots of babies. So who's going to leave more surviving offspring in a stable population, a pair of elephants or a pair of rabbits? So hopefully you figured it out from the cod example, from the fish example above, that the answer is neither. It's a trick question. They are going to both leave in a stable population exactly two offspring, one for the mom and one for the dad when they pass away, right? So stable means non-changing. Let's take a look now, though, at a growing population and see what that looks like. And this is exponential growth. So you can see here the curve of this graph growing at this really sharp incline. We have to say this little phase right here of the graph where the populations are really small and they stay kind of small for a while. We call that the lag phase. And this is the exponential growth phase, but the whole curve is called an exponential growth curve. So that is the pattern of population growth that you're going to see if there is literally nothing limiting the rate of growth on that population. Now, clearly, we're going to be talking about things that limit growth in a minute, but I just want you to understand what Darwin was saying on the previous slide, which was if nothing gets in the way, then this pair is just going to grow and they're going to cover the earth. The data that you're seeing in front of you are what would happen if you had 500 elk. And what would happen to those 500 elk if all of their offspring survived? Over the course of 80 years, 80 to 100 years, those elk would completely cover the earth. That's 100,000 million billion. So there would be 34 billion elk on the planet within 80 to 100 years if nothing kind of got in the way of that. So it turns out that populations can't grow unchecked forever. Exponential growth never lasts long in nature. It'll only last long if there's plenty of food and space. So what are some of the things that can affect population growth? And there's two ways to think about this. The first thing is to think about how population density is going to affect the growth rate. So population density simply means the number of individuals per a specific area. So you can say, how many elk are there per acre, or how many elk are there per square mile, or something along those lines. So the number of individuals per area is the population density. And the more dense the population is, clearly that's going to be a factor of how many there are, but it's also going to be a factor of how much area you're talking about. So when we're thinking about limits to population growth, we can think about how that population itself becomes a regulator of the population size. And we call things like that, I know it sounds a little weird, the population is actually regulating its own size in this weird kind of way that we call density-dependent factors. So density-dependent factors limit population size because the more dense there are in the area, the more numbers there are in that area, the lower the food supply is per individual, right? If there's 10 elk per square mile, then they're all going to have plenty of food. But if there's 1,000 elk per square mile, then the food is going to be limited. And the only difference between those two populations isn't the amount of food, it's how many elk there are. So the food supply is less when you have more dense populations. The same thing is true for habitat, for living and in breeding. Then that should be pretty self-explanatory. The next one on the list right here, if you're looking with me, is parasite and disease risk. So when populations are more dense, there is more a chance for you to pass on a parasite. You can think about, Europe, several hundred years ago and the Black Plague. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Parasites and diseases are more easily spread when the populations are more dense. Luckily today we've got antibiotics, so we don't spread the Black Plague as much. But in a natural population without antibiotics and other things like vaccines, parasites and disease risk are a big, big problem. The last one on the list is predation risk. And this one makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because the more prey species that are around, the more predators that are going to be able to have a food supply. And so the more predators are going to eat the prey, and that's going to limit how fast the prey population can grow. Okay, so those are, again, density-dependent factors. All of these things that I listed right here depend upon how many individuals there are in the population. I'm going to give you another way of limiting population growth in a minute, but let's just focus on density-dependent factors right now, because it turns out that these density-dependent factors cause the population to slow down, right? Here's the exponential growth curve, and it slows down in this way that we can graph called a logistic growth curve. And logistic growth curves are these S-shaped curves, and they plateau at a specific number, and that plateau is called carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is symbolized by the letter K. All right, so logistic growth curve ends up at carrying capacity, and those are all due to density-dependent factors. There's another kind of factor that can affect population size, and these are called density-independent factors, and there's your term right up here. I don't have it written in bold on the slide itself or in color, but that's the term, density-independent factors. And at this point, I hope you understand that density-independent factors have nothing to do with population size. They have a lot of stuff to do with bad luck, or maybe even weather, or some sort of seasonal change in temperature, things along those lines. So floods, earthquakes, fires, those kinds of things. So in this kind of graph, what we see is an exponential growth phase, no carrying capacity, followed by a drastic decrease in the population, followed by exponential growth, no carrying capacity, followed by a drastic decrease in the population size, again followed by exponential growth and population decline. So if you think about seasons, you might start to get the picture of why these are going up and down in this way. Think about insects. You don't see a lot of insects in the wintertime. They're all either dead or they're kind of hibernating underground. So when spring comes, they all kind of emerge, or they hatch out of their little eggs or whatever, and the population starts to increase. And what slows them down is not a limit on food or anything along those lines. What seems to slow them down every single year is winter. And so increase and decrease due to winter. These can also be caused by regular changes in like temperature or rain, those kinds of things. Those can all cause this density independent kind of graph that we see here. It's not to say that populations that are exposed like this, like those insects that I was just telling you about, I'm not trying to say that they never reach carrying capacity, but carrying capacity is a density dependent factor. It's a pattern, it's a density dependent pattern. And this is just focusing on density independent, and that's why it's not showing carrying capacity. All right, so that's your second graph. This, by the way, this chapter is full of graphs, and it's very important for you to look at those graphs, learn what those graphs are trying to tell you, and understand what each graph means. So this is our second of many, many graphs for this chapter. And here's our third graph. So this graph is looking at population size and very specific in a way that's called an oscillation. And at first, this graph going up and down and up and down and up and down, it looks a lot like the density independent graph that I just showed you here. But there's a difference. And the difference is that there's two lines on this graph. And one of them is a predator population size, which is this one down here. And the other is the prey population size, which is the lighter kind of teal color right there. So population oscillations happen going up and down like this when a predator and a prey are very tightly linked to each other. When a predator's main food source is a kind of one or just a very few sources of prey. So I'm going to take you through this graph really slowly and explain to you what's going on here and why they're going up and down. It looks like pretty much at the same time. So what's happening, first let's just focus here on the snowshoe hare, that's the lighter blue color here, and the snowshoe hare population is increasing, and then it seems to then crash. You can see here that at first like the predator, the lynx population is going down, but then it rapidly starts to increase. Now it's never going to get quite as big as the prey population. There's always going to be more prey than there are predators. All right, so sorry about that. So what's happening is the prey population is getting kind of high here, which means there's plenty of food for the lynx population, so the lynx population goes up. And it goes up until the point where it's made such an impression on the snowshoe hare prey population that their population numbers start to go down, which of course means that there's not enough food for the lynx predator, so their population goes down, which means that the snowshoe hare population has time to rebound, right? Which means that the lynx population then starts to rebound, and now they get so high that they're eating so many snowshoe hares that that population crashes, which causes the lynx population to crash. This is the idea of the oscillation. An oscillation just means up and down and up and down. So the lynx eat too many hares, reducing their food source, which causes their own population to crash, which allows the other population to grow. That is the idea of the population oscillation. And that is a density dependent factor, but you're not seeing a carrying capacity being met because it's the two populations are so tightly linked that they do this oscillation thing. So one of the things that population ecologists really pay attention to is how to manage our natural resources. We as scientists want to have sustainable yield, and that simply means that you don't want to kill off everything in nature, but you do want to be able to harvest some of those resources. And so population ecologists have come up with the concept of maximum sustainable yield. Maximum sustainable yield means that it's this way of effectively managing our resources in such a way that we have lots of individuals being born into that population without causing that population to crash so drastically that it takes a long time for it to recover. That's the concept. So it turns out that if it's a basic concept. It's a simple math process. You just have to know what carrying capacity is, which is K. Remember, K is carrying capacity. And then you just take K and you divide it by 2. And if you divide it by 2, you're going to get maximum sustainable yield. So K over 2 is maximum sustainable yield. And if you look at it on this graph right here, that number of individuals, K divided by 2, is halfway through this exponential growth curve part of our logistic growth curve. And that means that lots and lots of individuals are going to be being born, right? They're being born, but it's not slowing down here in this phase where it's too close to carrying capacity. You got too many density dependent factors slowing that growth down. So in a forest, if you're trying to decide how to cut down trees and which trees to cut down, it turns out that you don't want to cut down the big trees because the really big trees, those are the ones that can produce the most seeds and they're the most prolific. So cutting down large trees is not a good idea. You can cut down a fair number of medium or small sized trees though. Same thing for if you're trying to manage fish. You want to figure out what that carrying capacity is, divide by 2, and then don't let the population size fall below maximum sustainable yield. If it falls below maximum sustainable yield, you start to get into this slower growth phase, and you don't want to be here. You want that population to be growing really fast. So I've just described to you maximum sustainable yield. However, unfortunately, it's actually a really hard concept to implement. And let's go to the next slide to talk about why it's so hard to implement. Basically, there's 4 things here that's just muddying the water. For example, how do you know what carrying capacity is? Right? Carrying capacity is what is the population size that's reached when there's not enough food or space, or there's too much predation or parasites going on. That's carrying capacity. And we as humans have been harvesting our natural resources for a really long time. We don't really know what carrying capacity is for almost every species that we're trying to harvest. So figuring out a simple equation of K over 2 becomes difficult. That's the first difficulty. Our next one is that we don't often know how many individuals there are that are currently alive in that population. We do marker capture in lab, but that's just one way of figuring out. I guess it's easier to figure out how many trees there are in a forest, but you go and count trees in a forest. It's not as easy as I'm making it out to be. Think about how you would figure out what the population size is of fish in the ocean. This starts to become a real challenge. So if you don't know carrying capacity, and if you don't know the number of alive, then that's going to be a real challenge to figure out what maximum sustainable yield is. The next one is figuring out stability of carrying capacity from year to year. I've let you think that carrying capacity is just this number, and it turns out that it's not always the same number every year. For example, some years you've got a drought, and in a drought, carrying capacity is going to be lower because there's not as many resources to go around. And finally, figuring out which individuals to harvest can be a real challenge. So a great example, though, of a fishery that has figured out all of these things, and it's actually the only sustainable fishery that exists on the planet right now, is the lobster fishery. I know you don't think about lobsters as fish, they're not fish, but it's called a fishery because they are in the ocean. So the lobster fishermen have kind of got together with scientists. So we've got industry and science working together for a common cause, and they figured out the population, the carrying capacity, number alive, stability, all of those things. And also, very importantly, they figured out which individuals to harvest. They realized that you cannot be harvesting the really large female lobsters with all the eggs on them, because those are the ones that are going to repopulate the lobster fishery from year to year. So what happens is they all agreed that they would only take smaller animals that are just a few years old. This is why when I was a kid, you could go into a restaurant like Red Lobster or something, and you could get one of these monster jumbo lobsters. And these days, if you go into Red Lobster, you can get a nice little lobster. Tastes good, delicious, dipped in butter. But they're not harvesting the large females. They're only harvesting the smaller males and females that have not yet started to reproduce. So that's a lot of hope for the future. Like maybe we'll be able to figure out some of these other fisheries as well as some of the other natural resources that we're trying to manage. We're pretty good about figuring out the deer population. Every year, if you're a deer hunter, you might find out that you can get 2, or you can only get 1, or it's harder to get into the lottery, that kind of thing. So so we've been managing deer populations fairly well. We could probably do a little bit better on that. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it here. It's a little short, but the next section is on a slightly different note, and we'll take it from there.